We are now moving to the second part to our panel, but before we go there, we would like to show you our principal sponsor and Comcast. We could not do this Progress Seminar without our sponsors, and Comcast, we are so grateful. Comcast, you're on.
Hello, and welcome to the 2020 Progress Seminar. Comcast has been a proud sponsor of the Progress Seminar for several years. And though this year is pretty different, we can't exchange handshakes and cards. The importance of engaging and supporting one another, albeit virtually, is more important than ever. Speaking of engagement and support, here are some things Comcast has done in San Mateo County so far this year. Comcast continues to invest in our infrastructure to ensure that your residents and your businesses can connect quickly and easily to our services. We all know that distance learning for students has been a challenge for you, your employees, and your families. Our signature program, Internet Essentials, continues to connect eligible families and residents to the largest low-cost broadband adoption program in the country. Since 2011, we've connected over 1 million people in California. When the COVID-19 pandemic surfaced in March of this year and people started to shelter in place, Comcast was the first internet service provider to offer 2 months free service to eligible new Internet Essentials customers. We also started the Internet Essentials Partnership Program, where counties, cities, or nonprofit organizations can sponsor or pay for services for their constituencies. We want to thank the County of San Mateo, Sequoia Union High School District, and the San Mateo Union High School District for their recent partnerships with the Internet Essentials Partnership Program. Due to the efforts of these committed partners, many students who did not have broadband at home will now have access, which is more important today than ever. We also recognize that 2020 has brought racial and social injustices even more to the forefront. Uncomfortable conversations are happening at the dinner table and even in virtual work settings. Comcast is committed to having these conversations and to investing more in the communities where we live and work. We announced a comprehensive multi-year plan to allocate $100 million to fight injustice and inequality against any race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, or ability. Locally, we also announced a $350,000 partnership with the Opportunity Fund to provide microloans and wraparound services to diverse small businesses. We're here to support you. We're here to keep you connected, and we're here for all of our communities. Please visit our blog at california.comcast.com for more information. Thank you to the Redwood City, San Mateo County Chamber of Commerce, and enjoy the event.
5, 4, 3.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Aknin. I am the principal with Good City Company, and I'm happy to be here today as your moderator for the Future of Office Space. We'll jump right into the conversation, but first let me introduce the panel in alphabetical order. So the first is Dr. Robert Bell, better known as Bob Bell. He is my former boss and former city manager with the city of Redwood City. He has over 20 years' experience managing HR operations in both the public and private sector. He currently serves in 2 roles. The first is managing partner of Peak Point Consultants, working with public sector agencies, as well as the chief HR officer for Pierre Inc., a Wunderman Thompson company. And for all those that don't know, Wunderman Thompson is a leading ad agency with over 20,000 employees and 200 offices in 90 global different markets. And in that role, very relevant, Bob has been hired to engage a distributed workforce across the U.S. and Canada. Winsome Bowen is the head of regional transportation with Facebook, well known within the area as a leader in transportation and transportation demand management. She has over 25 years in the engineering consultant industry. She has provided transit industry leadership, led regional transit practice, pursuit planning, recruitment, retention, and has worked with professionals in the top 10 engineering firms. Winsome began her career in South Florida during the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and she relocated and joined Facebook in the Bay Area in 2017. where she leads Facebook's regional transportation strategy and partnerships. Mike Futrell is the city manager in the city of South San Francisco. He has a very storied and wide career across the country. He was the chief administrative officer for the city of Baton Rouge. He served as chief of staff in the U.S. Senate, was a member of the Louisiana House of Representatives and in the Baton Rouge City Council. He's practiced law with a private law firm and was a vice president of the utility company in Hawaii. And he also served as a submarine officer in the U.S. Navy. And he's been with the city of South San Francisco for about six and a half years now. And we all know that city of South San Francisco, there's been explosive growth within the biotech industry over those 6.5 years. And last but not least, Lena Tutko. Lena is the senior research manager with Colliers International, covering Silicon Valley and South San Francisco Peninsula markets. She has 10 years experience in the commercial real estate industry. Lena began her career in commercial real estate with Real Capital Analytics, having teams in both Silicon Valley, New York, and London. And prior to joining Colliers, she was the market research manager in Omnisnell, where she managed research initiatives for the global automation and medical business segment. So actually, I will turn it over to Lena first, who's going to give us a brief overview of how the office market is going in the area. So Lena, why don't you take it from here?
Great, thank you so much, Aaron. Very excited to be here today. Can you guys see my screen? I just shared my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, thank you. So again, thanks for having me on this Progress seminar. My name is Lena Tutko, and I am the Senior Research Manager at Colliers International, covering the Peninsula and Silicon Valley markets. And I wanted to start our discussion off by taking a look at some data that we have seen in the office market since COVID-19 and see what that data is showing us. So first, let's talk about the activity. Are deals still happening in our market? And the answer is yes. So let me direct you to the graph on the right. The blue bars represent absorption, which is leasing activity. So as we could see in 2020, we're about the same where we were in 2019. But the reason for that is twofold. One, we're taking a look at the deals that have completed within this period. But what we've seen is pre-COVID, there was a lot of demand in our market. So there were a lot of pre-lease transactions. So those are now hitting the numbers as new construction comes online. So the activity from this bar chart may look a little bit deceiving. And on the left, we see those new deals that have occurred since April of this year, since the COVID-19 pandemic really took hold in our area. However, when we take a look at net absorption, and we can think of that as occupancy gains or losses. So if we're above zero, that's positive net absorption or occupancy gains. What we're seeing is, in fact, year to date, we are having substantial occupancy losses in the market. And I think that's why we're here today to talk about the office market and calling death in this office market, since there is a trend of some tenants leaving the market. So to look into that just a little bit closer, over the last 10 years, if we take a look at the light blue line, we see that vacancy has been trending down in San Mateo County. And not surprising, over the last 2 quarters, we've seen a significant increase in vacancy. However, what's interesting here is if we look at the dark blue line, which represents asking rates, those are actually holding steady. We have not seen yet in the market a COVID discount, which speaks to the strength of the San Mateo County office market. And for some perspective, we have seen a softening in rents in the neighboring San Francisco and Silicon Valley markets. So that's what the rents and vacancy picture looks like. And what's really driving a lot of this vacancy in the market is sublease space. So this is something that we focus very closely at Colliers. We have a sublease report every month to see exactly who is, ditching their space. And we see over the last year, there's been a significant jump in the amount of sublease space in the market. And looking at the time period since COVID began, these are the 3 top companies that have left their space and currently on the market for sublease. So I think what's interesting to see here is really what we're not seeing. And what we're not seeing is any big spaces given up by the large tech companies. We're not seeing anything from the Facebook or the Googles. In fact, 2/3 of the sublease spaces on the market since COVID are coming from the smaller and startup companies, spaces that are under 10,000 square feet. And that's really the range that is driving the sublease market right now. So I think that's a very interesting insight. And lastly, if we take a look into the future of office, is this something that investors want to put their money into? And what we've seen in the last 3 weeks is yes. And in fact, we've seen a huge influx of investment. In the last 3 weeks alone, $3 billion has been invested into the market, with the largest transaction being the Genesis Towers in South San Francisco, which sold for $1 billion, making it the largest post-COVID office deal in the United States. So just looking at the data alone, it looks like the office, there is more vacancy coming on the market, but deals are still happening. Seems like we're kind of in more of a hibernation period right now.
Great. Thank you. That was excellent. I'm probably going to come back to you for some more nuanced questions about the differences that you're seeing between different markets, tech versus biotech and life science. But for now, I want to ask Mike some questions. I think most people who are watching this are pretty familiar with life science and the expansion of life science in South City. But can you just take a minute or two and kind of give a backdrop for Genentech and other companies, what their expansion plans are, and then touch on are they still sticking with those expansion plans, given everything that's going on?
Sure. Thanks for that. Great questions. And I really like that picture of the Genesis Towers in South San Francisco. Thank you for sharing that. It's a very successful project, and about 80% biotech. There is still some office there, but that's basically a biotech project. Biotech is on fire right now. I have since COVID hit, I've had 6 new biotech campuses pop out of nowhere and are starting the entitlement process. And that's on top of what we already have. I'm looking at our earlier projection of 9 million square feet in the next 20 years has really shrunk into like the next 4 years of biotech. And I've got industrial buildings, hotels being torn down with the idea of building biotechnology. So I've called around. I called down to San Diego. They're having the same just explosive growth in this space right now. And I talked to some folks in San Francisco about their office market yesterday. They're seeing the same in San Francisco, but they're very much constrained. San Francisco is very prescriptive on where biotech can go in the city. But globally, they recognize this is a health crisis. Health is being driven by biotech, looking for vaccines or improved testing or cures. And that's put a spotlight on this. And it's also, the industry is telling me it's relieved some of the regulatory concerns. If you go back to the beginning of the year, the big fear was that the federal government would step in and change regulations such that some of the R&D might not happen. Well, that's a lot of that's gone away, and the value of biotech has certainly been shown. So, we've got the big Kilroy project where phase 1 is fully pre-leased. That's 3 million square feet. Genentech goes to the South San Francisco City Council November 23rd for the final approval of their new 15-year master plan, which would have them theoretically, or at least entitled, to double from 4.5 million to 9 million square feet. And then just new players and old players. Alexandria is expanding. Phase 3, which has Genesis Towers, is expanding. HCP, Biomed Realty is still moving through their 5-phase development. So biotech right now is strong. Right now, the big question is, are they overbuilding? And I ask that question a lot. Everyone says no. They're right now in South San Francisco, there's a 4% vacancy rate for biotech. So put that another way, 96% filled. That's before COVID, it was a 2% vacancy rate. So there's been a little bit of change, but not much. And also know that biotech is a lot more than healthcare now. It's into the food industry. It's also into renewable energies, and that concept of biotech is being used in other areas. So the market is super bullish on this right now. A lot of construction headed our way.
Great. So quick follow-up question. I know you said a 15-year master plan and going from about 4.5 to 9 million square feet. How are they seeing that in terms of phasing? Have they given any indication about how quickly they want to build, and has that pace been affected at all from what's happening now from COVID?
Well, they've been clear from the beginning that they'll be entitled up to 9 million square feet over that 15 years, but the pace they're not yet sure. But Genentech has had a steady flow every year of some new project, of some new building. And I know they're replacing older buildings, building out their southern campus. So it may take them 15 years, one project at a time. I haven't seen that slow down. Got it.
Thank you. So I want to switch it up a little bit right now. We've been talking about office and potential office expansion, but we do know, and I will actually say, to Mike's point, I work in a number of different cities along the peninsula, and you are still seeing that demand for life science, in particular office space, and in particular people wanting to move forward with office entitlement. So that's good to hear. It's happening up there. To switch it up a little bit, though, to Bob. You've been working with the distributed workforce for a number of times. Can you maybe take about 30, 60 seconds to define how you define a distributed workforce, and then go into what you think, what are the benefits, the challenges of managing distributed workforce pre-COVID, and how you've seen it change over the last 6-7 months?
Before I start, I just want to say hello to everybody, and it's nice to see my panelists and know that others are out there attending this conference today. So like Aaron had mentioned, with Wunderman Thompson, we've had a distributed workforce, throughout my 4 years working for them now. And so we have employees that work remotely. We have employees that work in different offices throughout the world. And prior to COVID, we were in what I would call a virtual connected kind of work arrangement. And so even employees that worked remotely, we would bring them to different client sites for meetings. They would come to our Redwood City location to meet the executive team there, to meet with the staff that was stationed out of Redwood City. They would go to our parent company's office in New York. So even though they were remote, there was this sense of connection. It was kind of a hybrid model, if you will. Mm-hmm. And that came with challenges, even in a hybrid kind of situation, in terms of staying connected to your employees, the kind of management mindset that you need when you're managing a virtual workforce in terms of trust and making sure you're clear on expectations and that you're not micromanaging, because that's essentially impossible in a virtual kind of arrangement. But we were able to kind of manage that and keep the employees connected and part of our culture and part of our team. When COVID hit, cities have been dealing with and other employers, it really changed everything. So we went from a virtual connected kind of arrangement to what I call virtual. meaning everybody works remotely. And then when there's times where we're really dealing with big, significant issues where we would used to come together for strategic planning purposes, things facing the organization, that's out the door now. And so all of that has to be done virtually. And I don't think it's an effective way to do it in my experience thus far. So that's kind of the shift that we went through. You know, again, a company that had a tradition of managing a distributed workforce to this 100% all remote and virtual. And again, it has come with its set of challenges. I think in the future, and hopefully when this pandemic is over, we'll be going back to a hybrid model. And later on, I think I'd like to discuss kind of what the needs are then from an employer, from a perspective of office, and from a perspective of the communities where they reside in. Because that's something that not only are we looking at within, you know, the area of Wunderman Thompson that I work in, but they're looking at it globally. They had plans for 4 campuses prior to COVID, Wunderman Thompson did, in North America. They've kind of put that on hold for now, but my understanding is at some point they do want to move forward on that. It will just look differently. And I think, you know, I don't want to jump ahead too far, but when I think about the topic that we're discussing today, I don't think office is dead. I think it's just going to change. And I look forward to sharing more about that later in the presentation.
Got it. Thank you. That was a good background. Winsome, I'll ask you the next question. I know just from working with your team before, working with other teams with large tech companies, like the last 5 years have been, before COVID, were tremendously difficult in terms of just getting all of your employees to your campus. How do you see transportation planning kind of how has it changed right now over the last 6 months, and how do you see it changing for larger companies, balancing work from home with more traditional style of transportation demand management measures?
Good question. So I'm happy to be here, happy to virtually see everyone. Over the last few months, we have been taking a few steps back. We suspended our operations, of course, because there was no one to transport to the offices, because we're essentially on a mandatory work from home through the middle of next year, at Facebook at least. I think Google is in a similar situation. And we've been reviewing our operations protocols, looking for opportunities to collaborate with others, scanning the globe for emerging, I can't call them best practices because we're making up our new operations and cleaning protocols as we go along, to understand what's being put out there and what other entities may be adopting. We've been establishing what our new return to the office procedures will be in terms of transporting staff, and how do we continue or resume our transportation benefits, our transit pass programs, for example, support for Uber and Lyft, transportation demand management strategies. I think one word I've heard in many of the countless webinars across the country is opportunity for collaboration. This is an opportunity to really not just continue to rethink public space, but to look for ways that we can implement those new thoughts as to how we share space more effectively and accommodate more non-motorized travel, such as the open street concept, the bicycle streets and that kind of thing. I think we're still making it up.
Yep.
And I think we have a little bit of time to get it right. And when we get it right the first time, it's going to be adjusted again, because every phase of reopening will be a learning experience for us. I mean, we have the theoretical concept of how it might work, and then we'll see exactly how it plays out in reality.
I agree. I mean, I think we don't know exactly where it's going to go, but it's good that Facebook and Google are obviously transportation leaders within the area, so it's good to know that you're thinking about the future. I kind of more with your transportation background, I have a question about, like, how do you think save is too strong a word, but how do we get through the troubles right now with public transit and the lack of funding and getting people more comfortable getting back on transit over the long haul? Like, how would you see that going with your employees and other employees throughout the region?
That's a tough one. I think it's going to be a combination of, it's a lot of public information. What information will be most beneficial to the users in helping them to make a decision to trust transit. I know that APTA did a series of focus group sessions, and they came up with some strategies to convey information that's reassuring to the riders that this vehicle has been cleaned according to a certain protocol. And they realized that having that signage in your face, very visible, would probably be the most effective method to begin to convey trust. What we're finding is if you look worldwide, there's some countries where wearing masks has been part of the urban culture. So in those countries, particularly in places like Singapore, use of subways is still comparatively healthy, and the use of masks is common, for example. I think here we're all relearning how to use public space, how to board a transit vehicle, and how to engage with the drivers, the operators, and vice versa. I think it's really about education. I think it's about creating a set of robust incentives as well. But at the end of the day, I don't know that we can safely rely on just those measures to bring it back in any particular time. I think we need to be realistic and just face the fact that it's going to be a couple of years, at least, before we get back to pre-COVID ridership numbers. I think it's going to be a rocky 3+ years. And I think that's a general feeling across the country.
Yeah, no, I've heard the same, and I think like everything else, people are going to have their own comfort levels of coming back. But I agree, as much as we could communicate a clear message, we'll get people who are ready to come back and wear a mask and beyond to move forward. Because really, from a density standpoint, the most dense spaces that we have are public transit, especially during peak time. So that's going to take the most creativity to get people confident to come back. So Lena, I have a related question to you, and Winsome touched on it some. So companies like Google, eBay, Facebook have said, we're not coming back till at least summer of next year. Lena, what have you heard from some of your other office tenants about what percentage have gone back somewhat versus who's coming back, and have you seen them take any specific measures to get their employees comfortable to come back into the office?
Sure. So I don't have any specific data to the companies you mentioned, but one trend that I've seen time after time is what big tech does, smaller tech follows. So I think as far as going back into the office, the longer the big tech like Facebook and Google, Apple extend their work from home policies, that's going to follow into the market, and others are going to follow suit. Now, from 2017 to 2019, those big tech companies were expanding very aggressively. So what we saw is smaller tech also expand. So I think a lot of the companies are looking to those big tech companies for next steps.
Got it. So, Mike, I have a question about, we all know that most of the tech companies are staying home right now, but biotech companies don't always have that luxury because they're doing work within the lab. How have you seen kind of traffic patterns or the amount of people going into work? I would guess that it's not the same as some cities that have more 100% tech versus life science. Can you give some insight into that?
Well, traffic has been great, I'd say. The structure we had pre-COVID. But biotech is really attuned to the health risks, as you might expect. So even before working from home became popular earlier in the year, biotech was already on board with that because they're really attuned to what's happening. But there are a lot of biotech workers still working of necessity because they have lab work. And the distinction there is really between large companies and big companies. In South San Francisco, we have nearly 250 biotech companies, but most are small. And those small companies, it's all hands on deck all the time, and they're still coming to work. But companies like Genentech or Amgen, the larger companies that have marketing departments and finance and legal, HR, those office functions are being, they're at home. So 30 to 50% of their workforce is still working from home. I've heard even in the lab work, there's more rotation of shifts. So you have fewer people in the lab. But by and large, unlike what I am also hearing from typical commercial and tech, where it's a lot of people at home, biotech is back to work of necessity, but it really depends on if you have those ancillary services, they are staying home.
Got it. And in general, biotech has a lower density overall in their buildings than tech, just because a percentage of the space is used as lab space. So you don't have some of the downside of density that you have in some of the what we had previously in some of the tech companies. Bob,
they also have very sophisticated air filtration systems that are required for ceilings. So yeah, there's a lot more room to spread out and operate perhaps more safely.
Very nice. So Bob, can you dive a little bit more into what you were talking about before? What do you see as some of the benefits and challenges, and what's your prediction about how a lot of these companies will take on the next phase, whether it's a year from now or 2 years from now, about managing their workforces?
Sure. First off, I just want to chime in terms of our plans to returning people back to an office location. And I'm speaking broader for Wunderman Thompson, not just my area. But right now, we plan in the U.S. to return people back to work in the June timeframe next year. We did reopen our London office, and that has since been closed down just recently because of the uptick in COVID in Europe. But in terms of moving forward, when I think about what the benefits are for these distributed workforce arrangements for employees and for working remotely, and what I hear from our employees that do work remotely, it's about flexibility. It's about not having a commute. It's about, if you're in a dual career household, having the ability to relocate easily if your significant other or somebody within your household has to relocate for their work. It alleviates some immigration and visa issues, even though not as many as you would think. And it's a very complex area with more and more people working remotely. I think it's going to continue to be an area for a legal challenge and decisions. And depending on the nature of the role, there's a lot of flexibility in hours too. I think we were all accustomed, no matter what your role, when you went to an office, your work hours were office hours. Well, this kind of blows that up, and you don't necessarily need to work from 8 to 5 unless you're in some sort of client-facing, role, or you just need to work those hours to collaborate, with your team. So a lot of benefits in that regard. I think the challenges, and I really noticed these since we went 100% remote. When you think about work and what it means intrinsically, it's about connection. It's about a sense of purpose. It's not just about a paycheck. This is about things that really motivate you. We're a relational species. It's about having those relationships and being part of something bigger than just your individual contribution. That is really diluted when you're 100% remote. And so, I think as time goes on, people are going to feel, if this continues, more and more isolated. And with that comes loneliness. And with that comes fatigue. And with that comes less productivity. And so those are things that, if this was going to be some sort of permanent working arrangement, I think those are the things we would really be grappling with. And so again, I think the future is more of a hybrid model where, there's choice for the employee. Yes, I can work remotely and also, travel to a headquarters or, meet up with my colleagues at a client site, those kinds of arrangements. As well as having employees say, I actually want to be dedicated to an office. I enjoy that part of my career of getting up and actually physically going to work and being there with my coworkers. And so I think those are the models that we're going to see in the future. It's an expansion of what we were doing at Wunderman Thompson before all of this happened. And I think that, that's probably the wave of the future. And then one last thing, and this, this all hit, or we had planned all this stuff right before COVID hit, because as we hired our employees, we started to notice this, this lack of connection and also just kind of the lack of getting to know individuals we were hiring throughout the US and in Canada. And so what we had planned to do was each quarter bring all new hires to our Redwood City headquarters, have them spend some time there, get to know some of their coworkers, get to know Josh Perry, our CEO, and other members of the executive team. And then that was our way of kind of creating that initial relationship and connection. And we were also going to do an all-employee in-person retreat for the first time in the summer of 2020. All of those things obviously got blown up because of COVID, but those are things we're going to go back to once this pandemic is over. So I don't know if that answered all your question there.
No, that was good. I do have one follow-up question. Just came to mind. I was reading an article earlier, and we've seen a lot of headlines about some of the larger companies starting to scale pay depending on the location of where their employees are. Yes. And I think there was one recent, Reddit was saying, no, they're not going to scale pay, but some other companies are. Like, where do you think that's going to go? Do you think companies are, do you think companies see a distinct advantage of someone being able to be close and pop in the office when they need to, so they may pay them a higher amount versus more 100% remote employees that don't have that potential?
Right. I think that labor costs and hiring in different locations is a definite advantage to the employer. It's why we started to hire more remotely. We hired a lot just in the Bay Area when I first started with the company, and it just became too cost prohibitive because the talent there is in such high demand. So there's definitely labor cost benefits for the employer. So, and we do adjust on markets. So depending on where you live, we do adjust wages accordingly. But again, if employees wanted to be stationed in Redwood City or in the Bay Area or something like that in the future, we would definitely be talking about, the cost of living there and work with the employee accordingly.
Very good. So once again, going to switch gears a little bit and go back to transportation. One thing I'm working on right now is helping Commute.org out, and they have 17 different cities that they work with, helping them on their long-term strategic plan. And obviously that's a lot different now than it would have been a year ago. But one thing, talking to a lot of the elected officials that work with Commute.org are excited about is this: a lot of people are bicycling now that weren't before and trying to, getting from here to there with bicycles. Winsome, this question is for you, just thinking through from both working for a large employer, but also as a transportation professional. How do you think, how can cities go about engaging large employers and just getting, now that we have some momentum behind people using bicycles, because there's a lot more people using them now than 6 months ago, how can we as a region capitalize on that momentum?
So I know that in some cities, we've done some experimental street closures and dedicated them to bike and pedestrian traffic only. I think it's an opportunity to maybe formalize these into something more permanent. Of course, within reason, managing the demand for vehicular traffic, travelers, as well as non-motorized travel. I think the next step is to probably look at our land use and zoning codes and how we share our public rights of way more equitably, and equitably in terms of modes, to allow for dedicated bike lanes where none exist or where it's a shared bike path. And And I know that at Facebook, we've broadened some of our benefits to accommodate the purchase of bikes, because we have seen an increased interest in biking to work. I know we're not alone. It's probably similar to what's happening with other companies, whether small, medium, or large, tech or non-tech.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you just see it from the headlines to bike shops being sold out of bikes to just anecdotally looking around the roadway and seeing it. I have a follow-up question then for Mike too, as someone who's a city manager. How do you see, your plans for transportation and getting people? I know a lot of the biotech is on the other side, not really close to residents, but I assume there are a lot of employees of those companies that work or that live in South San Francisco or San Bruno in the areas. I mean, do you see a kind of a renewed interest in bicycling in South City and how that might play into commuting to the office space in the long run?
Well, there absolutely is. And the advocacy has certainly picked up. And that is coming from a lot of our residents. We have a lot of new residents that like that. But, as good as traffic can be right now, we're not being naive nor complacent, and know that at some point it will return to that Armageddon that it used to be, and want to use this time productively to plan for that, particularly with the growth that I mentioned earlier. That's going to come with the downsides of housing and traffic. So still very focused on finding solutions to that. So happy Measure RR passed. Yeah. Thank you to all of you who are on this call who voted for it and may have supported it. Yes, we will have Caltrain, but beyond bicycles, and we have a new bike and pedestrian master plan underway in South San Francisco, still very focused on the last mile. We have feasibility studies on a ferry taxi terminal that would complement our current WIDA terminals, and then a feasibility study with the county on glideways, which we and I personally feel is a really viable last mile solution for us to get from the Caltrain station out into our biotech core and even to our two BART stations and into our workspaces. So bike and ped is absolutely forefront, but it's just part of the whole transportation mix. And even in that day when people may work 2 or 3 days from home, one day traffic is going to come back. And we want to be prepared.
No, agreed 100%. I think this is a good time for us to go through all that strategic thinking about how, there's going to be some still work from home, but a lot of people are going in, and how can we combine different tactics now that conditions on the ground have changed. And one plug, as we're talking about bike and safety, and for all the city people who are listening in, there was actually a change to CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act, it's called SB 288, that actually makes it a lot easier to make those bike and transportation improvements. And if you have things like slow streets or new bike lanes or pedestrian closures, I would look to use that as a tool that wasn't there before. It just got passed into law. So before we turn it over to the people who are watching questions, we have a number of questions. I wanted to go back to Lena for one kind of final overview. What's your prediction in general for tech, for life science, not only over the next year, but over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years in the Peninsula market?
Sure. Well, I'm not one to make predictions. I'm going to look at our data, and the data shows very positive outlook for life science and technology in the peninsula. Number one, it's funding, both from the public side and the private side. On the public side, there's increased both from the state level and from the federal level, more grants going into life science and biotech. And also on the private side, there is a very robust VC activity happening right now. In fact, the third quarter was the second best quarter for Bay Area exits. And year to date, we've seen 39 exits, and 17 of those have been life science. So there's a lot, billions of dollars being pumped into life science and technology companies in our market. Also, there is a lot of specialized, already built out space in San Mateo County, specifically, as Mike mentioned, in South San Francisco, which makes it very attractive for new entrants and existing entrants to be in those big biotech campuses. They tend to cluster together, and San Mateo County has the biggest cluster when compared to the entire Bay Area. And lastly, I think with COVID, it's really accelerated the race to find a vaccine, more focus into therapeutics, diagnostic technologies, and those are all going to translate into more life science demand.
Got it. One follow-up question to that. Historically, we've always thought about, and rightfully so, as South San Francisco is kind of the capital of life science within the peninsula. I've noticed, over the last 2-3 years, and especially like San Carlos, Redwood City to some extent, the popularity of life science increasing, or demand for new office there increasing. I mean, have you seen the same thing, and how do you see that? How do you see that eventual kind of southward movement of life science happening?
Yeah, absolutely. It is moving south. Even in Silicon Valley, we're seeing a lot of R&D parks being rebranded as life science. So a lot of landlords and developers are trying to capitalize on this opportunity and use any existing lab space to kind of target those types of companies. Also in the East Bay, Emeryville and Berkeley, there's a lot of activity happening there as well.
Got it. Thank you. All right. So now we're going to turn it over. We have a handful of questions from the audience. I'll read the question, and then I might ask that one or two of you answer it. So John Hutar asks, please share your views on how the new look of corporate campuses and how they're used and how that might affect corporate travel over the long term. So maybe Bob, first to you. I mean, how do you see business travel? I mean, obviously, it seems, at least for a year, we're not going to have a whole lot of business travel. But beyond that, how do you see the demand for business travel? Because, I mean, obviously, that has a big effect on the hotel industries, transmit occupancy tax, and everything that goes on in the peninsula.
Right. Well, it's kind of like looking into a crystal ball, but I actually think if we're going to have a distributed workforce where people are going in and out of offices and geographically living in other areas, that travel could potentially increase. Yeah. If you work for a company in the Bay Area, but for affordable housing reasons, you live somewhere else in the U.S., then you might need to come to Redwood City headquarters or the Bay Area periodically, and so that could increase travel. I know of, and I forget what company it is, I just read this recently, they actually, and this was pre-COVID, but if you took a job with a company and didn't want to relocate, you would have to pay out of your own pocket for travel expenses. I don't know if I would completely agree with that, but they gave their staff that option. So we might see more of those kinds of models as well, which again, I think that would, in all likelihood, increase travel in the future if you have more employees working remotely that do need to go to different geographic areas for their work. And then I think one other thing I'd want to mention, and this deals both with travel and housing. So, one of the other things that I wanted to implement before all of this happened was a program where certain hires, so, members of the executive team that lived in different areas and other kind of key positions in our company, to actually have them come and physically be in the Redwood City office for anywhere from 30 days to 90 days when they start with the company, to really get indoctrinated in what we do and develop those relationships. And if there was more affordable temporary housing to facilitate that, that would have been awesome. That was my biggest concern if we were to implement something like that, is the cost of housing somebody temporarily in the Bay Area is it's just cost prohibitive. So, from a public policy perspective, it would be great to kind of see that addressed somehow through tax credits for the employer, or, whatever the case may be. That's definitely something that needs to be explored.
What's interesting about that comment, I mean, I remember about 4 or 5 years ago in the peninsula, kind of the corporate rentals were a big deal. And, I think people rightfully so were a little bit concerned about that because they were taking away housing that had been approved as long-range housing. What I have seen is, I know, for example, Google's building their Diridon development right now, 5,000 housing units, 7 million square feet of office space. But they also have a few hundred what are essentially short-term units for Google employees to come in. So they are, it seems like some of the larger companies have realized that same obstacle and are building it into some of their new campuses now. So that is interesting. Before we get to the next question that's up there, I have another follow-up question for Lena, because you just reminded me of it, Bob. You mentioned those mid-range companies, Lena, that had moved out, that had moved out. Do you know if they actually moved out of the area, or did they just decide they didn't need office space at this point in time, or are they not in existence as companies? But
we know that they've moved out of their office spaces. I can't speak to, I don't think they've relocated. I don't have the data on that.
Okay. Yeah, and I've heard of that too, that some where maybe their leases were up, they're planning to sign a new lease, but now they're just kind of waiting and seeing how things play out, since their employees don't need to be in the office right now.
But for the smaller companies, the under 10,000 square foot ranges, those are not re-signing. Those are going fully remote. Typically, they're waiting until this thing cools down to reevaluate. They're not renewing their leases at the moment.
Got it. Makes sense.
And I think it's going to be interesting to see in 2021, there's about 2 million square feet of office leases that are going to expire. So it will be interesting to see what the activity is like then.
That will be. All right. Next question from Diane. What do you think of the status of what do you think of the status of the service office provider? What do you think the status of the service office providers will be, such as WeWork and Spaces? What will the demand be post-COVID world? So, WeWork, I mean, obviously they've had a bumpy ride over the last 5 years. And I mean, how do you see that playing out, flexible spaces like that in the long run? I think, Lena, probably, again, this question is for you, and then maybe Bob to some extent too.
Yeah, sure. So in our markets, Silicon Valley and the peninsula, there's not a big presence of WeWork or co-working spaces. So it's kind of tough to see what impact it's going to make in our markets. But I do think that it does offer that flexibility if we are in this hybrid model, to be able to go into a physical office space when you need to. So there can be some opportunities for that market.
Got it. I also read an article about there's hotels now around the country that are renting out their spaces during the daytime for people who are working from home, but want to get away from their noisy home or whatever. And the hotels are actually seeing it as a second revenue stream, because there's not as much cleaning available, cleaning duties and things, and it provides people with a comfortable space to work. So people are obviously creative when they're going about these things. So Paul Krupka asked the next question. This one's for Bob. Do you see 100% virtual as unsustainable given the human need to connect?
That's a very good question. And I'm going to say yes. And it's funny because this morning, as I was kind of preparing for this, and I had prepared before, but kind of really putting my thoughts together around it, I kept thinking of this question, like, what is the future of virtual remote work? And will people really want to do it 100%? And I was also having a text exchange with two individuals who, knew I was going to be doing this today, who I totally respect. And in this exchange, because it's the holidays, I got a turkey emoji. And it made me think about remote work, believe it or not. And I felt like remote work is a lot like turkey. It's good for a day or two, and then you're kind of done with it. And I have a feeling that is really what is in store for us as we move forward. And so what I mean by that is, once we can all reconnect, we've had our remote turkey. And it doesn't mean we're never going to want turkey again. It just means that we have this craving, I think, to connect and feel like, again, we are part of something bigger than just a job, a task, or an individual contributor. And so I think that the need for human connection, the need for human purpose, that will drive the wave of the future in terms of workforce needs. And when I think about what that means for facilities as we come back together in office space and whatever arrangement that we end up having in our individual companies and as a society, I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so I'm going to want a facility and a community that already has protocols in place for returning to work. So in a mid-sized company, as the one of two HR people, I don't have to carry the burden of doing all that. That the facility's taking care of that for me. The community that whether they come to headquarters to just visit for a while, or if they're stationed there, that they have amenities that are walkable to them, that they have indoor-outdoor spaces, they have a community that is diverse, that celebrates inclusion, and that's reflected in the governing bodies that set policies for that community, and that they have the essential infrastructure they need for us to grow and adapt. So, when I think about both the human need and then what it's going to take when we reconnect, those are the things that come to mind.
Very good.
And the turkey.
Yeah, and the turkey. Well, speaking of, that's actually an interesting point. Your turkey made me think of it. That there's a lot of people within Silicon Valley that were used to certain perks of working within an office. Free lunches, coffee available at all times. I don't know if Wonderman had all those perks in all their campuses, but have you heard from either Wonderman employees or your other HR colleagues? Do you hear that as a big concern from employees? And there's a big group of, let's say, Gen Z and younger millennials that don't really know anything but that, having those perks within the office. Have you heard more about that?
Not since COVID hit. I didn't hear a lot about, we miss these perks and all that.
Yeah.
What we did have prior to COVID, I called remote envy. And what I mean by that is there were people that worked in our office that got the free lunches and, all of that. And then when you worked remotely, you didn't necessarily, have those same kind of perks.
Yeah.
So there were people that in office that thought, oh gosh, why do I have to come in the office all the time? I want to work remotely. And the nature of their job wasn't conducive to that. And then you had remote workers saying, what about all these perks that they get that we don't? And again, we were just at a point in our history where we were going to start implementing some programs to kind of make that a little bit more equitable. And then this hit, and that all changed for now.
Got it. So we have only about a few minutes left, but at the last, there's a comment here. We have another question now, but the comment is just basically, hey, there's this whole ecosystem and economy that's built on having people working, whether it's in downtown Redwood City or in campuses in South San Francisco. So Mike, how have you seen small businesses impacted by the fact that we don't have as many people, our daytime populations aren't as large as they were in the past?
It's tremendous, a tremendous negative impact. It's really driven home how much these large businesses have their own little ecosystem of smaller businesses that they support, whether it's printers or office supply, and then the obvious ones of catering and restaurants. There are catering companies and restaurants in South San Francisco that subsisted on larger companies or big events in San Francisco, because those aren't happening either, or companies that prepare meals for the airlines, because that's not happening either. So that whole ecosystem is suffering hard. I know the county and the city and others were doing what we can, but until they start coming back, they start flying airplanes, and hotels that have the same negative impact from airlines, and then the big events in San Francisco, particularly for us being nestled up against San Francisco. We have 3,400 hotel rooms. We really benefited a lot from those large conventions in San Francisco. So in many ways, this connection kind of goes unseen, but it absolutely has a negative effect.
Yeah, and I think that points to the fact that, when you're in, the eighth year of an economic cycle, it's really easy to focus on the downside of that, whether it's, increased traffic, obviously the housing costs, and a lot of folks have been negatively impacted for that, but it's not as easy to sometimes see the upside of that economic cycle, that there are a lot of small businesses that are benefiting from it. So once again, I think this is a good time for us all to take a look at that, and when the economy does come back and businesses do come back, to recognize that positive relationship between the larger and smaller businesses. So we do have two more questions, and actually one's related to that. Mike, with all this development, have you seen a lot of pushback from residents for the development, even in the midst of the pandemic?
First, we try to make that argument that you just made. Look at all this great stuff happening.
Yeah.
But people are people, and so yes and no. Because our large industrial area is completely separated from residential, we don't see as much when it comes to biotech campuses or things in the industrial sector. There are lots of questions about traffic, primarily. How are we going to handle the commute for those? But for the rest of the city, absolutely, and that would be residential construction mostly. There's a healthy contingent of NIMBYs, and we do our best to work and have community outreach. But it's a thing. I've been blessed with a really rational pro-housing council for a number of years, so that has helped. But you've seen it everywhere. Maybe just a little less here because all of our industrial sector is separated by Highway 101 generally.
Yeah.
So not.
Very good. And I think this next and final question, I think, is a very insightful one. And actually made me think of transportation first, but it's actually about kind of remote working. I think in transportation we saw that folks who didn't have as much means really impacted over the last 5 years of having to move further and further out and having to commute longer and longer distances. So they were disproportionately impacted by long commutes. This question's more about, hey, we're further exposing some of the equity gaps with distance working, with remote working, and that folks on the lower income spectrum just don't have the means, let's say, to have their kids in daycare all day. They're at home with them. So what do we do collectively to help with that equity gap as this distance learning and distance working goes on over the next year or two? I'd throw that to anyone, maybe Bob, from your HR standpoint, or Mike, or Winsome. I mean, any of you. But Bob, why don't you kick it off? What do you see some ways to, people who maybe don't get paid as much as at Wonderman, who are still doing distance, versus your higher end executives who do have means?
You really gave me that question, huh, Aaron?
Yeah.
I think
put on your city manager cap too, I would say.
Actually, it's exactly what I was just going to say. Yeah. I'm going to come from a place of my public sector experience, because I think there's a huge opportunity for the public sector, which kind of connects to this question. And what I mean by that is, I think as more and more companies have gotten used to having remote employees, including the public sector, I think there should be a whole reevaluation of what kind of jobs need to be actually right within the community, and what kind of job creation can we do in other parts of either California or other parts of the country. And so what I mean by that is, when I think about, the different kind of positions that we had at City Hall, the community facing positions, definitely, you need those kinds of employees in your community, police officers, planners for the most part, building inspectors. But then when I think of some administrative functions, and I'm going to put my own profession on the hot seat a little bit here, I wonder if there's an opportunity to have kind of hubs of those kinds of positions in different parts of the state that can create jobs, good paying jobs, and then help kind of spread the equity associated with these new kind of working arrangements. So I think that's a real opportunity. I also think it could end up saving the taxpayer money as well. So I don't know if that addresses this question directly. It's just something that comes to mind when I think about how to share in this experience in an equitable way.
Yep.
So if I may, Aaron.
Yes, go for it.
I just want to put a thought on the table. Public transit never stopped operating. in the worst of the pandemic. Even Samtrans, Caltrain, and the larger metropolitan transit operators in the state, such as the Metro, they continue to operate, though with 5% ridership. And who constituted this 5% ridership? These are the ones in our communities that are most at risk financially, the ones who travel long distances from the most affordable housing to the job centers. And I think realistically, we're not going to see this land use pattern change overnight.
Yep.
And so the question goes back to how do we reinforce the stability of public transport for these at-risk employees and residents and keep these operators in service? And that was one of the questions that was posed to me before in the prep session. And I think we really need to stay vigilant and remain engaged in the conversations with Congress to really press for much needed federal stimulus packages that would help. I think, yes, I underscore that other sentiment from Mike that it's a great thing that Measure RR did pass because it's going to open a world of possibilities for Caltrain. But this is an essential service for an essential sector of our community that cannot be overlooked. And I don't know, there is no easy fix to how do we maintain operations budgets, but it needs to be at the forefront of the public sector and others.
And if I could chime in on this one as well, we're having a really robust and productive discussion in South San Francisco on social equity. To be really corny, however that phrase is used, we spend much time focused on affordable housing, and if we build more housing, it's going to solve the problem. We've really expanded that thinking to what are the economic challenges for our low-income residents, and it's not just housing. It is transportation, but it's also childcare, as you mentioned, and it's healthcare, and so many things. And we need to be addressing each one of these if we want these people to successfully continue to live in our neighborhoods. And we do, because it's really not the tech workers working remotely that have my attention. It's the people in the restaurants and the hotels and retail shops who they're the low income workers. And if they have to leave the area, well, now they're faced with a really ugly, low quality commute. And then oftentimes they just get a job wherever they are. So I hear from restaurant owners prior to COVID that they couldn't hire people, and that the owner of the restaurant was having to wash dishes himself because they just couldn't get anybody to be a dishwasher because of the cost of living here. So, our new general plan calls for universal pre-K. How can we provide free pre-K to every child in South San Francisco? That's going to take a tremendous burden off a low-income family. How can we work with the county and the federal government to make sure they have really affordable health care? That's going to take a burden off. And every burden we can lift makes housing a little bit easier. Yeah, it's expensive. I get it. But a really holistic approach to how do we address that issue. So it is, in my opinion, one of the real benefits of all of the protests and social discussion that's happening in the country, that it's expanded our aperture of what we're looking at. And I think we're going to have a better solution at the end of that day.
Thank you. That is great. And I agree. I think the last 6 months have given us a perspective about the next time that we grow as a region, we should grow in a much more equitable way. So I think that's a great note to end on. And I'd like to thank everyone on the panel. I enjoyed this conversation a lot, and thank you to everyone listening and for the questions that were posted. So that will end the Progress Seminar for today. I would like everyone to come back next week, Friday at 9:45 for the next session. So thank you and have a great rest of the day.